The last time anybody besides a fighter pilot was able to hit Mach speed was in one of these. But that was 20 years ago. The Concorde didn't just hit Mach speed, it went double the speed of sound, flying from New York to London in under 3 hours. Today, you can only go visit a Concorde in a handful of museums. It's a relic, left behind by an industry that invested in efficiency rather than speed. But look online, and you'll see that there's a huge appetite for supersonic travel. The race to supersonic is heating up. I've talked to nearly all the companies building these new planes, and I asked them, why is it so hard to bring back supersonic? And what's the limit to how fast a passenger plane can actually go? In order to understand the challenges that they're up against, I decided to start here at the Concorde. So my first impression of the plane is that the head clearance walking in is extremely low. I'm 6'4", and I have to really uncomfortably duck down just to get in this doorway. So we're gonna see what it's like inside, but it's obvious that this plane's dimensions are totally different from normal commercial airlines. First of all, the head clearance in here, thank God, is a little bit better. But I am about touch. If I stand up straight, my head is touching here. So it is pretty narrow and low. Here's my hand against the window. Look at how small it is. When this plane was flying at such a high altitude, if there was a failure of one of the windows, these small windows were meant to slow that cabin depressurization. So it was a safety measure. And actually, on some of the newer planes that we're talking about, they don't even have windows. Attention Concorde passengers, on today's menu, duck l'orange, caviar, and champagne. Lots of champagne. I always wanted to hold one of these. Anyway, one of the things about the Concorde, it wasn't just about speed, it was about luxury. Every seat on this plane was considered first class, and the service was first class. There was a culture created on this plane of frequent flyers. A lot of the time celebrities were getting invited to the front, to the cockpit, and the pilots that we talked to have some really fond memories of meeting those people, interacting with them, and almost creating friendships with them.
The rock stars of that era, you know, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, they would use it quite a lot, and they'd certainly be there, and I certainly remember them. And I had a menu where I was collecting my favorite rock stars' signatures. I sent it back to, I won't mention the name, sent it back to somebody for that person to sign, and they thought it was a gift for them as it was their birthday, and they walked off with it, which was a bit of a blow, to put it mildly.
This is the forwardmost cabin before we get to the front of the plane and the cockpit, and I'm comfortably standing up now, finally. So that might be explained by the fact that, as you can see, the body of the plane gets sort of narrower towards the back. So we're in the front of the plane, we're towards the cockpit. The view is extremely narrow. If this was a car, I would not feel comfortable driving this on the road because the visibility down to the ground is extremely poor, hence the droop snout design. So the Concorde's droop snoot was a feature that allowed pilots to see the runway during takeoff and landing, but then snap back into place when it was hitting supersonic speeds over the Atlantic Ocean. The beginning of the end for Concorde came in 2000. After about 30 years of service, tragedy struck. So we're underneath the plane now, and you can see the landing gear on each side. And one of the things that's understood about when the plane actually did crash is that there was one of the tires hit something on the runway, and it kicked up the piece of debris into the jet fuel tanks, which are right here. And that's what caused the fire that caused the eventual crash. Concorde did start flying again not long after, but its fate seemed sealed. And the last flight was a few years later on the 26th of November, 2003. So over 20 years later, have any of these companies solved the big problems that Concorde faced while it was flying? Probably the most challenging obstacle these planes will have to overcome is their noise. The sound of a sonic boom has remained the biggest obstacle to supersonic flight since the very beginning.
So far, 7,000 people have complained to the Ministry of Technology and to the Noise Abatement Society. Only one man seems to have come out in direct praise of the boom, and that's a 74-year-old old-age pensioner who claims that the boom has cured him of his deafness.
We got a purpose to stop the Concorde.
In 1973, following a public outcry, the US banned overland flights for supersonic jets, followed by most other countries. That's why the Concorde was only ever allowed to fly supersonic over water. Planes have been getting quieter over the past 50 years too. That's thanks to improvements in aircraft design and more stringent government regulations on sound. So, a loudly booming supersonic jet would be even more noticeable compared to modern subsonic travel. So how does a sonic boom actually work? Here's what happens when anything travels faster than the speed of sound. So, sound is a wave of pressure, and for a stationary object, it travels in concentric circles out from where the object is. The waves of sound get pressed up against each other, and that wall of high pressure, that is the sound barrier. Breaking that barrier means an object is traveling faster than the sound it makes. It leaves behind a loud shockwave, kind of like the wake behind a boat that's going really fast. And that is what you call a sonic boom. If a plane booms too close to the ground, it can actually shatter glass. Many people, including myself before making this video, thought that a plane booms one time when it breaks the sound barrier, and then it's quiet as it's moving through the air. That's actually not what happens. As long as a plane is traveling faster than the speed of sound, it's leaving that sonic boom sound behind. For every 1,000 feet of altitude, the boom carpet left behind the plane is about a mile wide. So a plane traveling past Mach speed at 60,000 feet has a 60-mile wide swath of land underneath it that's hearing that boom boom sound wherever it goes. And for those on the ground, that boom is about 105 decibels. That's at least twice as loud as a normal plane flying overhead, and it's equivalent to standing next to a chainsaw or a car horn. So let's look at our 4 planes. It's worth noting that I originally spoke to 5 key players, but one of them went under while we were making this video. And it just goes to show you how much of a challenge developing these planes can be. Each of them has completely different approaches to supersonic travel, and each faces different challenges. The X-59, Boom, and Concorde all use similar technologies, flying at 60,000 feet and hitting between Mach 1.4 and Mach 2. Those kind of speeds can get you from New York to London in 3 hours, rather than the usual 7. The Halcyon will use a ramjet engine along the turbofan to get it all the way up to Mach 5. That would get you from New York to London in just an hour and a half. And the Stargazer is using a detonation rocket engine, something you don't commonly see outside of missiles. That might just do the same trip from New York to London in under 1 hour. So how are these 4 planes going to tackle the noise issue? Boom's Overture isn't looking to reduce the sonic boom at all at Mach 1.7.
With Overture 1, we're starting really simple. We're putting sonic booms out over open ocean where no one's there to hear them.
US regulations still ban all commercial planes from going supersonic over land. But researchers at MIT found that 78% of demand for supersonic transport was over land routes. Almost 40% of that was on US domestic flights. If these regulations change, Boom says the Overture could achieve a boomless cruise, flying at just over the speed of sound over land without an audible sonic boom. But this phenomenon requires specific atmospheric conditions to achieve. Flying any faster than that without making a lot of noise requires some really innovative design, and that's where the X-59 comes in. The X-59 isn't aiming for commercial supersonic flight like the others. It's actually one of 66 X planes developed by the US government. The X is for experimental. The first X plane was the Bell X-1, which was the first plane to break the sound barrier in 1947. The X-13 tested vertical takeoff and landing. The X-15 was the fastest piloted aircraft that never left Earth's atmosphere, and it hit Mach 6.7. It's taken NASA and Lockheed 6 years to build a prototype X-59. First off, X-59's engine is on the top, not underneath the wings.
So by putting the engine on top, we kind of shield that shock wave from reaching the ground.
Then there's the nose. It's a little hard to miss as it's 38 feet long.
The idea of minimizing the sonic boom is to keep those shock waves small, weak, and relatively evenly spaced. So that long nose essentially starts that process. It sets up those initial shock waves to be weak and kind of equally spaced along the first part of the airplane.
And lastly, the light carbon fiber further helps to reduce the plane's weight. Otherwise, the X-59 is built from parts of other planes. It's got a T-38 cockpit, which is a favorite for test pilots, and landing gear from an F-16. So, did NASA actually figure out how to quiet the boom?
We feel that we have. I mean, we have, shown in a wind tunnel, in an experiment and in experiment and analysis, that an airplane can be shaped so that instead of producing a boom, it produces a thump.
Their aim is to reduce the boom from 105 to 75 perceived decibels.
That's equivalent to either a car door closing across the street or the sound of distant thunder.
As part of the quiet supersonic mission, NASA has exposed communities to a simulated sonic thump. In 2018, they conducted one of these surveys in Galveston, Texas, with 500 civilian volunteers.
Mr. India, I heard nothing. That's Field Marshal. The Scotch Star heard a faint thump.
Eventually, the actual X-59 will make about 60 flights over a variety of yet-to-be-named communities in the US to collect more data. But there's another much simpler way to reduce the sonic boom: fly higher. Both the Stargazer and the Halcyon want to fly much faster and much higher than the other supersonic planes.
It turns out at roughly about 100,000 feet, a sonic boom about 100,000 feet is inaudible to the human ear. We can measure it with scientific instruments, but it's inaudible to the human.
That's Dr. Andrew Duggleby, the CTO and co-founder of Venus Aerospace. Just flying higher sounds like the easy solution, but when you're at those kind of altitudes, a whole host of other problems quickly appear. So right here on this chart, at 26,000 feet, is the death zone. That's where the air becomes too thin to breathe. It's why most climbers need oxygen to summit Everest. Almost all planes cruise higher than this, but the higher the altitude, the bigger the risk when something goes wrong.
When you're flying at 100,000 feet, if you lose cabin pressure and you don't manage it appropriately quickly, your blood will boil.
Oh my God.
So you basically have to treat it like a spacecraft cabin.
Yes. Airtight.
Yeah, but I think the solution that you see at the end of the day will look much more like a hybrid between a spacecraft cabin and an aircraft cabin today than just a pure aircraft cabin.
For high-altitude military planes like the SR-71, the pilots actually had to wear sort of a modified spacesuit because of the danger of the altitude and speed that they were flying. Our CEO is going to want to spacesuit up to get to their meeting in Tokyo a little earlier. I'm not so sure about that. But to be in a plane like this, there are so many things that could go wrong at a high altitude that you really need to protect your body from a worst-case scenario. And it's not just the pressure at high altitudes. There's one more problem with flying that high and that fast. You'll notice on this part of the wing, there's some black heat shielding. And the reason for that is that certain parts of this plane would be exposed to the most amount of friction at speed. The heat that could be experienced on the outside of this plane could sometimes top 250 degrees Fahrenheit, combined with the fact that the exterior temperature was well below zero at the high altitude, -75. That heat and cold caused a lot of stress on the outside of the plane. It meant that it needed a lot of maintenance, and it meant that it was a limit to how fast this plane could go. Going faster than Mach 2, Mach 3, Mach 4, Mach 5, you need to get into exotic materials. Aluminum, like this plane is made out of, just doesn't cut it anymore. It's when you get really fast that heat becomes the biggest problem. Aerodynamic heating increases non-linearly with speed. That means that as speed increases, the temperature rise becomes more dramatic.
What hypersonic really meant is the speed at which, and pardon my French, it's the speed at which heat kicks your ass. It's where heat becomes the defining problem. If you're trying to go make a missile, sure, maybe you want to go hypersonic because you have other reasons to go really, really fast to avoid defenses, right? There might be military reasons to go crazy, blazing, fast, hot. But I bet if I look at this from I want to sell commercial flights, how do I keep the cost down and competitive? I bet I don't want to fly a Mach 5.
So one of the centerpieces of this museum is obviously the SR-71 Blackbird. You can see on the tail fin here, there's the symbol of Skunk Works, which are the people from Lockheed Martin, their sort of top secret division that works on stuff like this. This plane broke speed records going over Mach 3. It's one of the fastest aircraft of all time, and everything about it is built for high speed and to deal with heat. The SR-71 actually reached 600 degrees at Mach 3.2, and the glass in the cockpit here was actually 1.25 inches thick quartz material. If you were to touch that, even with gloves on, you would burn your hand. So underneath the plane, the tires, again, because of the heat and the speed that it was traveling, these tires actually have inside of them nitrogen, not oxygen. The oxygen would just blow up at the speeds that this was going and the temperature it was hitting. And they also have a silver look to them because they contain aluminum, again, to deal with high heat that the plane was experiencing. The only way the fuselage could survive these temperatures was to make the entire thing out of titanium alloy, which is 10 times more expensive than aluminum. It's important to note that things that go into space and re-enter hit Mach speeds that are a completely different class. This thing would re-enter the atmosphere somewhere between Mach 16 and Mach 20. And that's why we always see on the space shuttles this black heat shielding on the front. That's actually reinforced carbon. As it's re-entering the atmosphere, it's exposed to heat that's on a different order of magnitude than anything that's flying, at 100,000 or even 180,000 feet. But even though these hypersonic planes aren't going to be hitting space shuttle speeds, finding solutions to these problems is going to take time and money. The Overture has been in development for 10 years at this point, and Boom's test plane just broke the sound barrier in late January 2025.
There we are. XB-1 is supersonic, faster than the speed of sound.
The X-59 is expected to take its first flight in 2025 and has already cost $632 million. That sounds like a lot, but building a plane is never cheap. Both the Airbus A380 and Boeing 787 Dreamliner cost over $20 billion to develop, and that's with huge manufacturing arms already in place. The CEO of Boeing said if they were to develop a new plane today, it would cost $50 billion. Exosonic was going to be the fifth plane on our list. They were also aiming for a very achievable sounding Mach 1.8 plane, using already existing engine technology. They closed their doors completely in November 2024. I spoke with the CEO before they went under, and he was a little more realistic about timeframes for this technology.
So at least for the airliner, we don't see that coming into the market until like mid to late 2030s, which I think, UBS or some other bank had a similar conclusion.
The speed of developing these planes isn't helped by the fact that there's literally only one place you can fly supersonic planes over land in the United States, the Edwards Air Force Base.
We can take off and immediately climb up to 30,000 feet where we're now cleared to go supersonic, and that doesn't exist basically anywhere else in the country, and certainly probably not even around the world. Edwards Air Force Base was established around 2 dry lake beds. It's roughly 35-ish square miles of naturally dry, compacted surface that's hard enough to land airplanes on. So there are other areas, especially over the water, where you can be doing supersonic flight tests, but that's not exactly a place you want to be if something goes wrong during the flight test. I don't want to be over the water, and I certainly don't want to be far away from a landable surface.
But the area is not completely uninhabited. We asked a few people in nearby towns what a sonic boom sounds like.
I've heard it described as the sound of freedom.
Well, sometimes you get the rumbling, the building will shake. And other times it's just a loud, like MAD or something going off, a big explosion.
So when people come here and enough in the area, they hear the noise, and the first thing they want to do is run out the store because they think it's an earthquake. So to me, it's funny, and I just look at the reaction and then let them know it's a sonic boom.
So, NASA, Lockheed Martin, Boom, Hermeus, and other organizations building supersonic prototypes will at some point be testing in this one strip of land in California. And it's not just the test flights. Finding the space to test engines is even more of a challenge. But that's changing. And we went to Jacksonville, Florida to check out why. This is Cecil Airport. It's outside Jacksonville. We're here for a press event. So basically, Hermeus is opening up a new facility here that's called HEAT, and it's going to be for testing engines. And they've got their quarter horse prototype plane inside the hangar here, so we're going to get to check that out, which is pretty cool. Let's go take a look at this plane. Wow, this looks crazy. Look at this.
So in order to test the engines associated with hypersonic flight, there's only a couple places in the country that you can do it at the scale that we need, at the scale of the F-100. And that primarily, the kind of like go-to one is Arnold Engineering Development Complex. And that facility is bottlenecked in the entire country because everyone wants to get in there. And so what we want to do is not only bring in something that will help us accelerate our roadmap that isn't bottlenecked where everyone is trying to get there, but also increase the capability of the country.
So this is the tunnel. This is the inside of the tunnel where they're going to be testing things like the quarter horse and other engines. And it's hard to tell, but it's super, super quiet. Hermeus, an Atlanta-based firm, is arguably the furthest along in testing their hypersonic prototypes. They're planning to modify the Pratt & Whitney F-100. That's the same engine that's inside an F-16. So what they're doing is cocooning that engine inside of proprietary technology to take what was an engine that could go Mach 2 and giving it the capability to go Mach 4, 5, and above. You spend a lot of time in Washington.
I do.
And that means you're probably talking to people from the Department of Defense.
Yes. The systems you see the department investing in right now are one-way systems, right? You send them, they launch, and then they don't return. And so every time
AKA missiles.
Missiles, $20 million a shot or more. And so the cost is really challenging to scale. When you have a vehicle that returns, the cost per effect of those munitions significantly decreases. It would also have the impact of unlocking a lot of private capital.
Hypersonic weapons are at the center of an arms race among the world's superpowers. That's because a hypersonic missile remains within the Earth's atmosphere, unlike an ICBM, which goes up in a sort of parabola and then comes back down. In theory, it makes hypersonic missiles harder to detect. The US has spent over $10 billion on hypersonic weapons so far, about 3% of the overall R&D budget for defense, and it seems to be with good reason. China may have already tested a hypersonic nuclear weapon, and they've built wind tunnels that can test speeds up to Mach 30. According to articles we've read, Chinese scientists have patented an engine that can go up to Mach 16, and one Chinese company called Space Transportation is building what they call a rocket with wings. Take a look at this wild CGI video. Do you think that the United States is behind on hypersonic?
I think it's an incredibly difficult competition. We have a different approach in general to how China and Russia have taken it. I mean, the flight tests kind of speak for themselves. The pace of flight testing that China, the CCP, have been able to demonstrate over the past decade exceeds ours by an order of magnitude. And I think that speaks for itself.
So I guess the last question is, when will you feel like hypersonic passenger planes are a real thing?
Ask me again once we've flown a hypersonic aircraft. That's step one that we gotta prove out.
So we know it's going to take a long time before supersonic or even hypersonic passenger planes are going to be in the air. And development is going to take a lot of investment. Another problem that Concorde just didn't have. The development of the Concorde was completely subsidized by the governments of France and the United Kingdom. Rolls-Royce, the engine manufacturer, was actually government-owned during the Concorde era because it had filed for bankruptcy. The airlines didn't even have to buy the planes.
I mean, initially, let's face it, the airplane was basically given to British Airways. I mean, they didn't have to pay a cent for it.
That level of state investment just isn't happening today, and that's definitely going to slow development.
I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a commercial supersonic around 2050. And to kind of unpack that, we would need to have both low boom aircraft and very abundant, very cheap SAFs in order for supersonics to succeed. And 2050 is about the time frame that I think it could happen.
That's Dan Rutherford. He's an environmental engineer that's been researching aviation emissions and policy for about 15 years. SAF stands for Sustainable Aviation Fuel. It's still an emerging technology, but it's one that's going to play a crucial role when it comes to these planes because of just how much fuel they need. Let's compare fuel use against standard subsonic airline travel. Commercial planes vary, but take the two most common planes flying today, the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A320. Now this of course varies on route, weight, and lots of other factors, but as a fairly high estimate, they both use around 3 tons of fuel per hour. Now compare that to the Concorde, which used a massive 22.6 tons per hour and for a lot fewer passengers. Even if you were to calculate it per distance, Concorde gets 13.48 miles per gallon to a 777's 80. Now, it's obvious that jet fuel is different from petrol. It's actually closer to diesel. But for a simple comparison, a full flight on Concorde is the emissions equivalent of every passenger on board driving from London to New York in a Ferrari 812 Competizione. And not only is it burning more fuel, but even the same amount of fuel use could be worse for the environment at higher altitudes too.
Because supersonics would fly very, very high in the sky, there's a concern that emissions from their engines will have a disproportionate impact, especially on the climate. And just kind of ballpark figure, if a plane is operating at, say, 33,000 feet, emissions from its engine stays in the atmosphere for like 2 or 3 days. But if you take it and you make it supersonic and you fly at 55,000 feet, what we call the residence time, or the amount of time the pollution stays in the atmosphere, is more like 2 or 3 years. And that's very concerning, both from climate change and then for ozone depletion.
How are these newer planes going to solve this efficiency problem? Well, the truth is they really aren't. The main problem is the faster you go, the less efficient travel becomes. In fact, Saudi Arabia wants to invest in supersonics precisely because of this. They highlighted the future of supersonic flight as a key focus in their oil sustainability program. Here's a graph showing the drop-off in efficiency at greater speeds. The higher up on the graph, the more efficient the plane. Boom is probably the closest of these projects to reality, and they claim that the Overture is 30% more fuel efficient than Concorde, maybe moving them up here. The Halcyon will be using a ramjet and end up somewhere around here on the graph, just beyond the SR-71. The Stargazer uses a similar engine, but also adds their brand new rotating detonation rocket engine for higher speeds. Rockets are way more inefficient, and if you look at the bottom of the chart, that's where you're going to see the rocket propulsion. Not a lot of planes use rocket propulsion for that reason. Compared to the Concorde's 22 tons of fuel per hour, this thing burned 20 tons of fuel per second. Now, it's not an exact comparison, obviously, because the planes that we're talking about are not launching directly up to get out of Earth's gravity well, but it just gives you an idea of how much fuel it takes to move weight up into the atmosphere. I mean, you could kind of see the design is different, right? They're more compact. It's just about throwing as much power through it as you can. Venus is targeting a specific impulse of 1,250 seconds, which the company claims will put its hybrid rocket ramjet engine in line with standard ramjet performance. But that's still 80% less efficient than a 747. And rather than 400 passengers, it carries only 12. Engine efficiency may not be the sexiest topic, but all of these planes will undoubtedly be worse for the environment than subsonic travel we have now. It's not just the environmental impacts either. This fuel costs a lot of money, and it might just be the make or break reason that flying supersonic just isn't profitable for these companies.
It's a lovely goal. Everyone wants to go higher, faster, farther. We don't like to use that phrase too much, but but at some point there are limits. And in the case of airplanes, the limit for speed is Mach 1, a little bit below it, practically speaking, to be commercially viable. Beyond that, no.
Here's a graph of jet fuel prices over the last 50 years. This flat period of low prices was Concorde's era. Since then, fuel prices have shot up. So while a trip on the Concorde in 1999 costs about $154 per passenger in fuel, that flight today would cost over $700. And for Boom, the numbers are looking much worse. They've made a commitment to sustainable jet fuel.
Today's airplanes are actually only 50-50 compatible with sustainable aviation fuel. And Overture, we're designing to run on up to 100% sustainable fuel.
Sustainable jet fuel is a type of jet fuel made from either renewable sources like plants or algae, or repurposed waste that's intended to have a lower carbon footprint.
But the thing to know is that SAFs remain very expensive and very rare. So typically, SAF costs between 2 and 5 times as much as fossil jet fuel, and it only accounts for 0.2% of fuel use today. So it's very much a nascent technology.
So if Boom achieves their 25% more efficient than Concorde claims, and SAF costs the $8 per gallon that it cost recently, That means the fuel alone for each passenger on a flight from London to New York would be around $1,500. If SAF hits the highs of $10 that it did multiple times last year, that would be almost $2,000 in fuel costs for every single passenger. Those are really rough estimates, and maybe Boom will manage to squeeze a little more efficiency out of their planes, but it gives you an idea of just how expensive these fuel costs could be. We reached out to Boom about this, and they told us they're aiming for a $5,000 round-trip ticket. If that's true, $3,000 to $4,000 of that would be fuel alone. They told us, we've designed Overture to be profitable for airlines at fares similar to first and business class. That includes fuel costs, which we expect to go down over time as the supply of SAF increases along with demand. And there's one other big problem with this plan. SAF often isn't actually as sustainable as it sounds.
Well, there's a lot of diversity hiding under that term, sustainable aviation fuels. A SAF can be produced in a sustainable way with a good feedstock and reduce emissions by 80% or more compared to fossil jet fuel, but it also can be produced in a way that actually makes it more polluting than fossil jet fuel. So to take an example, if you take palm oil that's derived from like a deforested area and turn that into a SAF, then that's actually going to have higher life cycle emissions than fossil jet fuel, just because of all of the carbon you released when you cut down the forest. The US government is aiming for 3 billion gallons of SAF supply in 2030, which is a 100-fold or more increase from today. So those would be SAFs produced from corn or soy that offer modest, if any, greenhouse gas benefits.
It's going to be a tough task to balance out fuel costs, environmental damage, and heat problems, all while making a comfortable and affordable ride for passengers. Now that we've seen all the supersonic prototypes, who's actually going to fly on these things? All the CEOs we talked to said similar things.
I think it's typically the business traveler, the folks that you would see flying in business class or first class today.
When we talk to people who are the most frequent international travelers in business class and first class, 97% of them say they want supersonic flights.
You land in Japan at 2 p.m. your time, but it's more like 7 a.m. their time, and you take an Uber or you ride a taxi to the factory. You're able to have a meeting with whoever you're meeting with for like 3 hours. You can then board a flight and get back home in time for dinner.
And in a world of super fast internet and remote calls, do we really need to be flying these CEOs across the planet at hypersonic speeds? And finally, for the nearly 10% of CEOs who are super commuters, traveling 100 miles or more to work, one study found that they consistently underperform their localized counterparts, causing their firms to lose value and their tenure to be shorter. It's even worse if they own a boat or live near a golf course. It turns out the only person who would actually fly supersonic and be home in time for dinner was the pilot of the Concorde.
I would drive my wife early in the morning to the station, our local station. She'd get on the train, commute into the city, and I would go to Kennedy, get in my Concorde, fly to London, go swiftly through customs and immigration and come out the other side and get on as a passenger on the evening Concorde out of Heathrow. And I'd get back into Kennedy, get in my car, drive up to Katona and pick my wife up at the station. She having been to work all day, and me too, I suppose.
But even for the ultra wealthy, are they going to pick speed over comfort? When you can already fly in luxury on a private jet, is the few hours saved going to be enough to entice people back to supersonic? Could there be a faster supersonic future? Maybe, but it's not happening anytime soon. And there's a lot of reasons that people should think about and be concerned about what the implications of that future might be.